We estimate that CB2 products have a success rate in the range of 60 to 70%. CBD, on the other hand, and this coming straight from pain clinics studying the effectiveness of CBD, they're claiming that CBD success rate is Okay, so now I will go through points to illustrate the differences between CB2 and CBD. And that's because, not surprisingly, we get asked quite often what the difference is. Part of that reason is that a lot of people are using our products as an alternative to CBD. And of course, the name CB2 resembles CBD, so there is often some confusion. But I'm hoping that after this segment, you'll have a very clear understanding of those differences that you can relay to your customers. So the first is, in my opinion, one of the most important differences, and that is our CB2, when used as recommended, has no known adverse drug interactions. And this is incredibly important to know because a lot of your customers that are coming in will be taking some other products, whether they're pharmaceuticals or other natural health products. And many of these can have adverse drug interactions with various products. As mentioned, our products do not have adverse drug interactions. CBD, on the other hand, has a number of known adverse drug interactions. So if a person is taking any other product, whether it's a supplement or a drug, there's a risk that they are going to experience adverse reactions. So when it comes to safety, CB2 is a far safer product to use. Reason number two is, as the name implies, our CB2 products actually activate CB2 receptors. This is where all the benefits come from. When you think of the therapeutic benefits related to things like cannabis, again, the benefits come from the activation of cannabinoid receptors. However, CBD does not activate any cannabinoid receptor, despite being considered a cannabinoid. CBD is known to have some indirect benefits to the endocannabinoid system, but direct activation of CB2 receptors or any cannabinoid receptors is not how it works. Reason number three is bioavailability or absorption. And of course, you can't get any benefit to anything that you ingest if you're not gonna absorb it. And terpenes in general are very well absorbed. They're well absorbed through inhalation, they're well absorbed through ingestion and sublingual use. They're even well absorbed transdermally or topically on the skin. CBD, however, is very difficult to absorb, and in fact, it's probably the main limiting factor in the therapeutic use of CBD. Think of the challenges with CBD in a similar sense with curcumin. And many of you will know that curcumin is a very difficult compound to absorb, and that's one of the reasons why the best curcumin products on the market have put their curcumin through some sort of technology or added some sort of substance to make it better absorbed. That is the same story with CBD. The best CBD products will have some sort of technology applied to it or added some sort of other substance to make it better absorbed. However, the vast majority of the products on the market are just plain CBD, which essentially means your customers are not absorbing it and will not get the benefits. Reason number four, and this is likely due to a combination of the previous two reasons that I just discussed, we estimate that CB2 products have a success rate in the range of 60 to 70%, or roughly 2 out of 3 people who use it will find it works. Now, CBD, on the other hand, and this stat is coming straight from pain clinics studying the effectiveness of CBD, they're claiming that CBD success rate is in the range of 33%, or just 1 in 3 will find it works. So you can think of our products as having double the success rate as CBD. And this is interesting because CBD has this halo effect, and of course it's been in the media and everyone's been talking about CBD for the last few years. As you are starting to hear more and more people use it, you're going to start to hear a lot more stories of people who were really disappointed with their CBD or the effects that CBD gave them. So again, when you think of success rate and trying to actually help your customers feel better, CB2 is going to be a better choice. There's actually a pharmaceutical rep quoted saying up to 90% of drugs on the market have a success rate in the range of 30 to 50%. So when you think of CBD, even though a lot of times it's positioned as this miraculous substance, CBD's success rate actually falls within that range. So it's not a magic bullet, and I think you're going to find that a lot of your customers who have tried CBD will report the same. Reason number 5 is that every single ingredient that we use in our CB2 products has what's known as G.R.A.S status, or G.R.A.S, and that stands for Generally Recognized as Safe. And this is a US-based food safety designation, meaning that these are food ingredients. On the other hand, CBD has had its self-affirmed G.R.A.S status revoked by the US FDA due to a lack of safety data. The corresponding organization in the UK, the FSA, is also reevaluating the safety data surrounding CBD and questioning whether it's safe for long-term use at a certain dose. So again, when it comes to safety, CB2 is going to be the better option. Now, reason number 6, just because an ingredient or product is G.R.A.S or has G.R.A.S status, it does not necessarily mean it's safe for dogs. It's great to know that our products have been approved by Health Canada as a veterinary health product, so proven to be safe. We have excellent claims related to joint pain, stress and anxiety, immune system health, and general health. Now, when it comes to CBD, there's actually very little safety data for its use in dogs. And this is the reason why Health Canada has not approved a single CBD product for dogs. Not one. Now, people often think, well, they could experiment with CBD in their dogs. A lot of people have done that. The concern is a lot of these products, and the best CBD products, are often considered full spectrum. And what that means is that CBD product will contain THC as well as terpenes. And there are certain terpenes that are toxic for dogs. And a lot of times people use these products with hemp essential oil or hemp-derived terpenes. Well, keep in mind that the hemp essential oil or the hemp terpenes will often contain these toxic terpenes for dogs. Reason number 7, CB2 will not test positive for a banned substance on a drug test. We have many of our products being used by individuals who work in public transit sector, in the oil and gas industry, the mining industry, and a lot of professional athletes who are drug tested will be using our products as well. Contrast this to CBD. Every marketplace study that's been done on CBD has shown that the vast majority of the CBD products on the market test positive for undisclosed THC for banned substances, whether for work or athletic events, and they think they're using CBD. There's a high risk that they will test positive and get fired or lose their standing in athletics. One way that people get around this is to use something called CBD isolates, and this is pure CBD. And they think that because they're using pure CBD that they're safe from testing positive on a drug test. And that's not the case either, because over time, CBD can degrade into other compounds that will test positive for banned substances on these drug tests. So again, whether they're using CBD isolates or other CBD products, if they are drug tested, whether at work or athletic events, it's important that they use our CB2 products and not CBD. We have a great real-life example of a powerlifter who was using our CB2 products to recover from a shoulder injury. And he used it throughout the recovery process, throughout training, and then during competition in Costa Rica, he broke the world record. And of course, if you break the world record, you're automatically chosen for a drug test. And of course, as expected, tested negative. So again, real life situations showing that our products are absolutely safe for drug tests. Reason number 8 is that our products are legal to travel with across international borders. And so if you have a customer looking to take their pain reliever or anti-anxiety product across the border, our products will absolutely be legal to take. Now, of course, CBD is legal in Canada and legal in some states in the US. However, you cannot cross that international border. You can't go from Canada to the US or vice versa carrying CBD. It's still a criminal offense. Now, the risk of going to jail is quite low, but these individuals will have serious delays to their travel plans and possibly miss their flight. So again, if your customers are traveling across the border and looking to take with them their solution for pain relief, sleep aid, or anxiety relief, absolutely make sure that they're taking our CB2 and leave their CBD at home. The last point, reason number 9 of the differences of why CB2 is better than CBD is affordability. And CB2, when you look at a therapeutic use of our CB2 product, you're looking in the range of $30 to $60 per month. Now, if you're looking at the same thing with CBD, and keep in mind, I'm talking therapeutic doses, not these small 10, 20 milligram doses that you find on the black market, but these therapeutic products where you're using 300 milligrams of CBD a day, you're looking at hundreds of dollars per month. This really makes it difficult for your customers to afford and doesn't really make a pain-relieving, stress-busting solution accessible to many people. So when it comes to affordability, definitely consider recommending our CB2 instead of CBD. In fact, one thing I'd like to really point out is that in January 2022, we at Cannanda made a commitment to freeze our prices for the foreseeable future. And this was at a time where inflation was skyrocketing. Every brand was increasing, using that as an excuse to increase their prices. And we decided to take the opposite approach and keep our products affordable and accessible for your customers. So we froze our prices and we haven't touched our prices since.